Welcome to Inspire Campfire, a podcast where ordinary people tell their stories of extraordinary adventure. These are campfire stories meant to inspire the rest of us to light the fire within, get outside, follow our dreams, and return to tell our own stories. Ready? Let's strike the match.
Welcome to the show. I am your host, Scott Wurzbacher, and today we're going to find out who's really afraid of the big bad wolf. I have with me Jess Edberg, the executive director of the Dorothy Molter Museum in Ely, Minnesota. You might remember her from episode 66 when she came on the show to tell us about the life of Dorothy Molter, who spent most of her life in the remote wilderness of the Minnesota boundary waters and serving root beer to traveling passersby. That episode was a huge hit. And as it turns out, Jess has many of her own adventure stories, which includes a full through hike of the Appalachian Trail. Jess studied equine science in college and has a degree in animal science from the University of Wisconsin. She has a diverse career focusing on wildlife, including trapping wolves and deer for research and providing education and information services for the International Wolf Center. It was the part about trapping wolves for research that really caught my attention. And I'm so excited to learn from Jess today about her adventures and the mysterious cunning and the pack nature of the wolf. Jess, welcome back to the campfire.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to be back.
Yeah, so fun. And I love your background. For those that are listening and can't see, you're sitting in it looks like a Minnesota scene with some beautiful lakes and trees and conifers. It's taken me right back there to my trip to Minnesota. Jess, I am so excited to hear about your adventures. You've had like a whole lifetime of adventures, and it seems like there's sort of a thread that's kind of tied all your little journeys together. But I wonder if we could just start with your journey leading up to your time at the International Wolf Center.
Sure. And I feel like I need to preface this with, I had no intention to end up where I am now. And I think it's important for young people to realize if you choose to go to college and you think you know what you want to do, it's okay to shift gears and to do something else, because when we're 18, 19, 20, we think we know what we want, but we change so much, from 18 to 30 in our lives, in our interests, in our passions. And sometimes we get kind of stuck and we think we're not meeting our goals or other people's expectations if we don't stay on the track that we set for ourselves. And that's kind of how I felt until I ended up here in Ely. And so when I graduated college with my horse degree, I had big plans, and I was working at a vet clinic for horses west of the Twin Cities. And I loved my job. I loved what I was doing. And then I had already planned on doing this Appalachian Trail hike.
Yeah.
So the vet clinic hired me knowing I was going to do this, and I would be gone for 6 months. And when I left, I talked with the owner, and we decided that, when I'm coming back, they would like to hire me back, and they were happy with my performance. So I left on the Appalachian Trail thinking I would come back doing the same thing.
Right.
So I was gone for 6 months, did a through hike of the Appalachian Trail in 2001. And it changed what I wanted to do. I never thought of myself as going to grad school and getting a doctorate. And while I was hiking, my confidence changed. I was much more self-aware after hiking. And I thought, I think I'm going to go to grad school and really focus on equine reproductive physiology, because that's kind of what I was focusing on at the vet clinic. And so I got back, and the job that I thought I would have wasn't there. And,
Wow.
as a young person, 23, 24, it was crushing. I was really frustrated, and so started sending out resumes, cold calling different equine facilities, vet clinics, barns, stables, trying to find work within a reasonable driving distance from my dad's house, which is where I was living at that point. And it was fall, it was October, and that's kind of the lull season for a
Yeah.
lot of equine activities in Minnesota because we've got really cold winters. And so there's not a lot of hiring going on at that time. And I got odd jobs. I worked at Target for a while for their holiday season. I was bumping chairs at Afton Alps, which is a ski hill outside of the Twin Cities. I was at a cleaning company, and I just felt really down and frustrated and started looking for graduate programs in equine reproductive physiology. And I wanted to go to Colorado. That's where a really great program was, and they weren't taking students at the time. So I thought, well, what else do I really love to do? I love being outdoors. I just hiked the AT. And so I started looking for wildlife graduate positions or ships, and started just emailing. And of course, 2001, email was there, but it was still pretty early, and Google wasn't really there. And so I couldn't do online searches for all of these things. So I was just emailing professors at places where I thought it would be interesting to studying large carnivores or small carnivores. And I wanted to focus on pine martens. That was my favorite forest carnivore in Minnesota. They're a little weasel. And I stumbled across the U of M and Dave Meach, who is a world-renowned wolf biologist. And I emailed and said, I'm interested in studying forest carnivores. Do you have anything? What is your application process? And now, during this time, I was also studying for the GRE, the graduate record exam, so I could apply. And when I emailed Dave Meach, I had no idea who this guy was. I didn't even say his name right. And he emailed back and he said, well, I have a 2-year waiting list for the graduate program, but I have an internship up in Ely doing some field work, trapping deer. Would that be interesting to you? If so, here's the application. And I thought, well, this is weird. But it's a job.
Yep.
It's field experience, which I had none with wildlife. And I was talking to my dad about it. And my dad, before my brother and I were born, used to come up here and go on Boundary Waters trips and was familiar with Ely. And he was also familiar with Dave Meach because he looked at me and he's like, hold on. And he reaches over to the bookshelf and pulls off the famous 70s book, The Wolf, that Dave wrote. And he's like, is it this guy? And I was like, oh, that's a really good sign.
Wow.
This guy has a published book. And so I applied and did a phone interview and was hired. And I think the only reason I was hired for the position was because I have been deer hunting since I was 15. So at that time, it was at least 10 years. And when you're trapping wildlife, there are situations where the animal is injured, and it's not often, but it's something that could happen. And so you have to be mentally prepared for essentially doing what's best for the animal, which depending on the injury could mean dispatching it or killing it.
Understood.
And I think that was like, oh, so she's killed deer before.
Yeah.
She probably has the mental and physical, attributes of doing this job that I want to have. And so I got hired, and that's how I ended up in Ely. And so I was hired for a field technician position. This is 2002 now. In February, I moved up here the beginning of February. There was a few feet of snow on the ground. It was really cold. And I started deer trapping for the wolf deer research project that Dave Meach started decades before and was funded and managed through the U.S. Geological Survey, which sometimes doesn't make a lot of sense to people when you say the USGS, but this was the 70s, late 60s that Dave started this project. And so that was kind of the entity that provided the umbrella for funding for Dave
I
to do.
gotcha. All right. So I want to time out for a second, and then we're going to come back to this project. But I just want to touch on a couple of things that you said.
Yeah.
So first of all, I loved the way that you preface this whole thing, that we don't always know where we're going when we get started. Near and dear to my heart, I have a 16-year-old that's going to be a junior in high school. And so we're very, very gently kind of starting to think about things like that and,
Yeah.
where we want to go. And so I'll certainly be making sure that she listens to this episode, which will be great. But I also want to touch on this Appalachian Trail through hike. And that's probably a whole nother podcast. But I wonder if like just a few of the nuggets from that trip, because it sounds like that trip changed you, like you got in touch with something that created a shift. And I just wonder if you could just touch on what happened there.
Yeah. It's probably one of the accomplishments in my life that I'm most proud of. And some people, they hear that you've hiked the AT and they're like, so you just walked for 6 months? And yes, that's what I did, but it's so much more than that. And it's similar in how it led me to a personal transition to when I did a semester abroad in college. Whenever you take yourself out of your comfort zone and put yourself in a position that's new and strange, and everything's unknown, you meet people you would never have met before.
Right.
Your worldview just expands
Right.
exponentially. And I think that is really important for young people, because often when we're growing up, until we go off on our own after high school or whatever, process people go through, um, we're limited to what our family exposes us to and to what our community exposes us to. And if we're from a really small community, sometimes that can be tighter. Of course, internet exists now. It didn't exist when I was going through this. So there's more access to information. And you can travel virtually to different parts of the world, but actually having that experience changes you. And it's hard to explain unless you've gone through it. And I didn't want to hike the AT at first. My partner at the time was super interested in it and convinced me that this would be a cool thing to do as a graduation kind of end cap
Sure. Yep.
celebration. And I read a book about it, and it was a kind of a memoir. And then I read Bill Bryson's A Walk in the
Yep.
Woods.
Yep. Yep.
And the two of those books convinced me that even if I didn't finish, it would be a really good adventure.
Yeah.
So I did it. And we started, down in Georgia. We went south to north. Our idea was we're going to have this very exciting conclusion to this by summiting Mount Katahdin at the end. So that was why we went south to north. And it was a lot harder physically than I imagined. Flatlander Minnesotan, the high, what's Eagle Mountain, that's the highest peak. So, trying to train for something where you're in the mountains 100% of the time, either going up or down, was difficult for me because I couldn't visualize it. But it physically made me stronger. My body changed in ways that it never could have by just doing regular going to the gym or, running or exercise. And so when I physically got stronger, it occurred to me that my body is capable of a lot of things that I never considered. And then that slowly changed my mental kind of thinking, in that, well, if I can do this physically and mentally, being able to stay motivated and continue hiking, even though some days it felt like worse than the worst job ever, I can do whatever I want to do. And I can accomplish a lot of things that I never considered before.
I love this. So for you, it kind of started with sort of a physical transition that took you into this mental space and really kind of delving and dialing that up.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, so let's go back to the USGS Minnesota Wolf Project. So yeah, take us through that.
So when so the position that I was hired for was primarily deer trapping, and the study that I then was a part of was, and I'll paraphrase here, but so Dave Meach started studying wolves, and he was working on a project at Isle Royal, so the island that's in Lake Superior.
Yep.
And it's an isolated population with wolves and moose, and then very few other, generally large mammals. So, wolves, moose, fox, beaver, snowshoe hare. But there aren't any other predators, and moose are the only ungulate. And so at the time, I believe it was Durwood Allen was had this research project there. Dave Meach was studying under him, and Ralph Peterson, who is now the Isle Royal wolf biologist that lives out there seasonally.
Okay.
Dave and Ralph were studying out there, and a closed ecosystem like an island in the middle of a Great Lake, there's not a lot of variables in terms of studying predator-prey relationships. And so Dave came to northeastern Minnesota in the Superior National Forest to have a study of wolves and their main prey, which was white-tailed deer, still is white-tailed deer, but also have other variables in the equation that he could figure out what are these influences and how does it affect the population. So, up here we've got all sorts of stuff: coyotes, fox, bobcat, lynx, the occasional mountain lion, and then we've got the deer, we've got moose. Woodland caribou used to be here. They were extirpated. And then people. Not a whole lot at that time, but people enjoying the forest, recreating, living in the woods, and so it was a more maybe accurate picture of wolves on the landscape with humans. And that's why he came here to start this project. And so as a predator prey study, you also, you need to track the predators, but you need to track prey as well to get your data. So I was hired for the winter deer trapping. So
Okay.
you don't trap wolves in the winter because the forest cover is too thick to do any kind of aerial darting like they do out west. And so wolf trapping.
What is aerial darting?
So for example, like in Yellowstone National Park, when they want to put a radio collar on a wolf, because it's such a wide open habitat or ecosystem, and the wolves can travel much farther, and it make it harder for traps to be set and not catch other animals. They target by using a helicopter. So they send out a helicopter, and there's a biologist with a dart gun, and they dart the wolves from the air, or they
Gotcha.
use nets.
Okay.
There's net rockets, basically like a big shotgun that shoots a net.
Got it.
And so for wolves here in Minnesota, it's just not practical.
Yep.
And so you trap during the summer and the fall using foothold traps. But I was a winter hire, so we were deer trapping, and the purpose was to put radio collars on. And the goal was to re-trap some deer, specifically does. And here in northeastern Minnesota specifically, I'm sure it's similar elsewhere, but so the white-tailed deer, the does maintain home ranges that are fairly, they might be 5 miles to 40 miles in size, or sometimes 1 mile, depending on food plots. Whereas the males tend to roam quite a bit more. So especially during breeding season, going out of where they were born, looking for unrelated females to reproduce with. So the doe was the primary target because they stick around. And Mike Nelson was the field biologist stationed here in Ely. So Dave was the head of the project, and then Dave was the guy that I answered to when I was actually working here.
Okay.
And Mike was a deer specialist. So he worked for the Wolf Deer Project, but he was really interested in deer. And so one of his little side projects on this was figuring out how far they migrate during the winter time. And so here, because winters are so harsh, they tend to migrate. And that could be, 1 mile, it could be up to 40 miles as well, to food areas that still provide adequate resources during the coldest, most bitter times of the year.
Gotcha.
And he wanted to find out how big are these migration patterns and how well do they know where they are? So spatially, do they know where they are at all times? And so he wanted to recollar some deer that had been collared already so he could maintain this long-term study, long-term data collection for the same deer. So we used clover nets and rocket nets to trap deer. And the clover net, I always thought of it as, when you watch really old episodes of the Looney Tunes and they have like a box and then there's like a little trap door
Yeah.
and then there's the string that attaches
Yeah.
and then there's a tripwire over a pile of food. That's exactly what a clover net is.
Okay.
It's a metal frame, so like a cast iron or steel frame box, and then netting on all sides, and then on one of the sides, so when you enter, it's the long way, the door slides up, and then you tie a string to a tripwire that is right over a little bed of treats. So
Okay.
usually alfalfa hay and grain.
Okay.
Up here, the deer don't eat a lot of corn. And so when people feed deer corn, if their digestive system has not grown up with corn, they don't develop the enzymes necessary for digesting it. And so there are times where deer will starve with a full belly of corn
Wow.
because
Okay.
they can't digest the nutrients out of it. And so that's why we didn't use corn, if anybody's curious. We used grains and like black oil sunflower seeds, which are much more digestible. And the trapping is usually late winter. So late winter is the time that is the deer are the most vulnerable. So there's very little food resources. They've already experienced winter up until that point and living off their fat reserves. They're most susceptible to predation by any predator. So the trapping is best late winter because the deer are more likely to go into these areas and put themselves in a more dangerous position by going into this little trap. So that's why it's done the way it is and when it is.
Gotcha.
And so they put their head down to eat some of the food. And then when they lift their nose up, it trips that wire and the door slides shut behind them. And the netting helps absorb the initial panic because they'll start to jump around and try to get out. And so that netting helps absorb that energy when they're bouncing off
Okay. Yeah.
of it. And so the checking the traps was the most exciting part because the deer will hear or smell you before you realize they're in the trap. And it varies depending on, conditions and topography. But once we started to hear them getting up and moving around in there, the door would rattle a little so we could hear. And then we run. And we do not recommend this for children because we're literally running in the woods with a knife. Get as close as possible, as fast as possible.
Yeah.
So this trap, it's like a rectangular shaped
Yep.
box. On two sides, it's tied to small trees.
Okay.
So we run up with this knife, cut the rope, and then the trap kind of folds down on itself. And then again, that netting kind of lays over the animal, and then we literally lay on top of the deer to calm it, like hold it
Okay.
still,
Yep.
calm it. Um, so there's two of us in a team that would work together. And so one would be lying on top of the deer with our body weight, just holding it down. And then the other person would be preparing the anesthesia.
Okay.
And so they're regulated drugs. So we had to document every time they were used and how much we used. And the amount used for these drugs is calculated by the estimated body weight of the animal.
Okay.
And so you would always err on the conservative side. You didn't want to give them too much. And so they'd prepare that, and then we'd inject them, and then step away and go hide somewhere and allow the animal to just, as calm as possible, process those drugs in its system
Sure. Yeah.
so that it would be knocked out so that
Yep.
we could process it. And so the processing wasn't just radio collar work, which was an important part of it. So we would usually do that first. And you always test it before you put the radio collar on
Makes
any
sense.
critter, because, the last thing you want to do is find out after that the battery is dead or it's
Yeah.
a default defective of some way. But there is more to it. There is more sample collecting. And this is a long time ago. They might do things differently in other areas, but a blood sample, um, tooth sample. So the incisors on wildlife, depending on the animal, are going to be those front teeth, like the nipping or nibbling teeth.
Okay.
And for deer and ungulate species, it's been found to be a fairly accurate measure of age when you take an incisor and you do a cross section. It's kind of like counting the rings on a tree.
Yeah. I was gonna say, sounds like a tree.
Yeah. And so for ungulate species, that is a pretty accurate determinant of the age of the animal. Now, if it's a recollar of an animal, so they already had a collar, we're replacing it with a fresh one, that's not necessary because they already have documented
You
the
already know.
age
Yeah.
of the deer the
Mhm.
first time it was radio collared. But that's a good way. So they have tooth sample, um, and then, body measurements. So we try to weigh it if it's not too large of a deer, with a pulley system and a scale and basically a blanket,
Yeah.
kind of put it on the blanket and then weigh it. Length, height, all of the different kinds of measurements you could examine. Um, and then once all of the processing is done, they would often get some kind of antibiotic booster shot. And
Okay.
that was kind of a prophylactic, to ensure that if they did, get an injury that we didn't see like a stick scraped them or punctured them
Yep.
on their shoulder, the tooth being pulled, it would keep any kind of infection at bay until that was able to heal.
Yeah, it sounds like a very humane process. I'm curious, like what you just described, what is the time period that all of this is taking? Like how long does it take to trap the deer? And, how much of this is you waiting around and how much of this is you being actively engaged in this process?
Yeah. So I'll start once there's an animal in the trap. So once we've got a deer, then it's a very, very quick process. So the goal is to have the animal anesthetize in as little amount of time as possible. Because anytime you anesthetize a mammal, it can be really hard on their system, humans too. And so the less time they stay under, the better it is for the animal. And so, sometimes in situations where like a hoof got, there's some netting that's wrapped around it, it might take a little bit more time. Or if they're, we need to turn them over gently. So it really, every situation is different, but 25 minutes or less
Okay.
was kind of like
It's pretty
goal.
quick. Yeah.
Yep. And we tried to be quicker than that just because we want the animal to not have a bad experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course, so at that time, there's different drugs now. I'm not familiar with current wildlife, best practices and industry standards, but at that time we were using a mix of drugs where one of those drugs was reversible. And so it would speed up the process that the animal metabolized all of those drugs, and they'd wake up faster and be more coherent faster. And so we would always, always, always wait until the animal stood up before we left the scene,
Got it.
because we wanted to make sure that that animal had all of their faculties, physical and mental, so that if like a predator came in, they'd be able to escape and we
Yeah.
wouldn't have caused them to
Sure.
be.
Yeah. It's a very structured process. Yeah.
It is. And there's a lot of moving parts. And so there was a lot of training that went into this before we were approved to do this independently as technicians. Um, and an anesthetized animal coming out of the drug could, they're pretty wobbly, and they could fall over and their nose could end up in a puddle and they could drown,
Mm.
so we always make sure that the animal is standing and that they're mobile before we leave it to its own devices after the process is over. So that part of the process might be another 20, 30, 40 minutes,
Yeah.
depending on the size of the animal,
Yeah.
and how fast they metabolize everything. But before you trap an animal, it could be days. It could be, there were some traps where we didn't catch something for a couple of weeks,
Okay. And so
but
how often are you checking the traps?
daily,
Okay.
every day.
Got it.
Yep, every morning. And especially in the wintertime, the temperatures can dip really low overnight. And so if an animal was trapped and is in this thing overnight, you need to be mindful that they might be chilly. They're made to be outside 100% of the time, but when they are having all of these stress hormones, the cortisol, and like
Mhm.
us,
Absolutely.
we have an adrenaline rush, and then if we're not careful, we could go into shock. If it's a really stressful time or injured or we're, whatever. And so early in the morning every day, traps are checked.
Gotcha.
And if it's going to be really, really cold, I remember times where we just didn't even set the traps. We would tie it open so that they could still go in and get the food, but they couldn't get trapped in it. And so that was another measure that, if it's going to be 40 below overnight, we don't want an animal sitting in this trap
Yeah, no.
potentially
Makes
freezing.
total sense.
Yeah.
So, can we pivot to the wolf, and is the
Yeah.
process similar?
No, not at all.
Okay.
So for wolf trapping, and again, different research projects do it differently. For areas with a lot of tree cover, like northern Minnesota, foothold traps are the most efficient and effective method. And wolves by nature are territorial, and they live in family groups. We call them packs. Oftentimes, all of the members of a pack are related except the male and female, the dominant pair, because they're the mom and dad.
Mhm.
And you wouldn't want your brother and sister to be starting a family. So they naturally avoid, inbreeding if possible. Isle Royal is a whole nother program. But and so you have these family groups that are establishing, maintaining, and defending a territory. And up here, outside of the boundary waters, there are trails and old, railroad track, paths, logging roads, main roads, driveways. There's all sorts of pathways that wildlife will use because it's the path of least resistance,
Right.
especially
Yeah.
in the wintertime. So when you're trapping wolves, you tend to go to those established trails and trap off of those trails. So in the summertime, the trapping is done in more remote areas, not the boundary waters, but remote areas that are a little bit more difficult to access for the average person. because you don't want to inadvertently catch somebody's dog that
Yeah.
they're, out walking off of an old road,
Yep.
or have people, messing around with the traps.
Makes
Now,
sense.
in the fall, when things up here kind of slow down, there aren't as many people, then that focuses in more in the boundary waters, because traffic up in that area is much slower. Although it is one of the most beautiful times to go, it's more challenging because the temperatures can be super variable. And a lot of people aren't comfortable camping when it's 40 degrees or colder. But
Sure.
that's when the wolf trapping would happen up there because of that. And so the trapping up there would be on portage trails, um, because the wolves, if they're traveling in the forest, they might check out up and down a portage trail or hiking trails. So there's two main hiking trails. There's the Snowbank Lake that goes around Snowbank Lake, which is like 24 some miles, and then the Kekakabik Trail, which goes from the Snowbank Lake area over to the Gunflint Trail area.
Okay.
And so those trails would be used as well. And the method is the same. So a foothold trap is kind of what you would imagine. It's like when it's closed, it's like this, and then you set it and it's like this, and then the animal steps in the middle and it closes on their foot.
Okay.
And then there are different types of footholds. So if you're trapping for harvesting fur, you might have a different like model or style of foothold trap. So the study traps have been modified significantly to reduce the potential for injury.
Okay.
And that means on the jaw, so like on the you've got the jaws that come together
Yep.
like this. On the part that's going to close around the foot, they're usually lined with something that flexes, like rubber.
Okay.
And then they often have like offset teeth. So not sharp teeth necessarily, but like square teeth that interlock. But what that does is when it closes on a foot, it leaves open spaces so that blood circulation can
That makes total
continue
sense. Yep.
effectively.
Again,
Now,
very
wolf,
humane.
yeah,
Yeah.
and there's still controversy around the whole idea of foothold traps and things like that. And so you kind of have to weigh, is the information gathered as a result of this worth the few instances where animals are injured? And that again is a whole nother conversation. But that's why there's such heavy modifications, is to really reduce any chance of that. But swelling is always, anytime you restrict, you know, if your watch is too tight, you're gonna
Sure.
feel that. You're gonna have some swelling or discomfort. And then another modification that was there when I worked, and again, it's been a long time since I've done this, was an ampule. I'm trying to figure out the camera, maybe like an inch high, and it's rubber. So it almost looks like when you have a bicycle tire and the little air thing sticks out,
Yeah.
that you can put air into it. It's kind of like that with a little bit of the rubber flap. And those are zip tied to the outside of the trap. And inside the little rubber knob that sticks up is a sedative.
Okay.
So depending on, what sedatives are available, like a common one that you might have for your dog at the vet clinic is acepromazine. And it chills the animal out. And it makes them a little bit, loopy, but the idea is that if they start chewing at the trap, which is a normal reaction to figure out what is on my foot, um, they'll eat that, and the tiny pieces of rubber will pass through, but then they'll absorb the sedative, and it helps kind of calm them down and mellow them out in the moment. So then when it kind of wears off, they're more calm. They've kind of processed that initial shock of what's going on and that fear response. And then most of the time, when you would approach the wolf in the trap, they're lying down and they're kind of hanging out, waiting there. And when I did it, a lot of people were like, oh my gosh, you know, wouldn't the animal attack you? And isn't that scary? And 99 times out of 100, the wolf is going to react submissively because they're afraid of us.
Okay.
And so they kind of cower. But they have a, you know, a 6 to 8 foot chain that's attached to that trap, and then a grappling hook at the end of the chain, so that this trap was not staked, you know, in one spot. It was designed to allow the wolf to run. And then eventually it catches that hook in the forest on vegetation or
Oh,
a root
wow.
or a
Okay.
tree.
Yeah.
So that burst of, you know, like when we get that fight or flight response, the
Yeah.
adrenaline, and then we do one of those two things. So if the flight response kicks in, they can run, and it bounces that chain along, and then it eventually
Until it
catches.
catches. Yeah. Wow.
So
That's so
that way they're
interesting.
not tugging at their, you know, and,
Hmm.
you know, harming the musculature of
Yeah.
their shoulder, or, you know, stretching their foot. So, um,
So wolves, this is my naive here, right? But like wolves, my understanding is like they're traveling in packs, right?
mhm.
So what happens? What's going on with the other wolves when an individual wolf gets trapped?
So we don't know unless there's a game camera, which a lot of times now that game cameras, you know,
Yeah.
in the last 10 years, you can get one for $25. So having a game camera facing the trap, you know, there's way, way more information about wolf behavior and how they react when they're trapped now than when
Yeah.
I was
Makes
doing
sense.
it. And I'm not privy to a lot of that. I'm kind
Sure.
of not in that world
Yep.
anymore. Um, but you know, wolves generally travel in packs, but they don't all necessarily travel in a single file line all the time.
Got it.
So wintertime, a lot of the, you know, imagery we see is they're all traveling in the same path because it's efficient for them in deep snow, which is true. But in the summertime, especially if it's a breeding pack where they have pups, one or two wolves might go out and kind of spread out in the forest hunting for food for the pups. So they're in a pack, but they're not always traveling with each
Yeah.
other
But
at all times.
when you come across a wolf that's been trapped, you're not worried that there's 50 other wolves kind of hiding in the trees ready to come get you.
No, no. And there's only been, and it wasn't me, it was a person that I knew that had
Yeah.
trapped before, where there were other wolves, 3 or 4 of them hanging out in an
Mm,
area. But that was because it was a pup that was trapped. So summer trapping is also a time where you can trap pups. Now, the foothold traps, there are different sizes for different reasons. So the smaller the animal, the smaller the trap, the bigger animal, the bigger the trap. But pan that's in the middle when the trap is open and set only pushes down when a certain weighted animal steps on it. So pups generally don't even trigger the trap until they're at least 40 pounds,
got it.
50 pounds, which would be late summer.
Yeah, makes sense.
So in late summer, the pups, you know, are by October, they're basically adult size looking. They might not be as heavy as an adult yet, but they're still big enough to trigger a trap. And so that might, you know, get more wolves to hang out because it's a young wolf. And, you know, they're kind of keeping an eye on it. But they also get different collars too. So they get, you know, if that's the goal, to get pups collared so that they can understand the pup behavior and travel, you know, what they're doing. The collars are expandable. So they're designed to grow
With
with the wolf
with
as it
the wolf. Okay, that
matures.
makes sense. So once the wolf is in the trap, is the process kind of similar to that of the process for the deer where you're trying to get them released
Kind
as
of.
quickly as possible?
Kind of. So we definitely don't lay on top of them. That would result in a bad situation. So in order to administer the drugs to a wolf, they use what's called a jab stick. And this is used for, a variety of applications in wildlife, and sometimes domestic situations. If you have a dog that's very fear aggressive,
Okay.
you can't get close to it to anesthetize it. And what it is just basically like a 4 to 5 or 6 foot long pole with a spring mounted syringe on the end.
Okay.
So you load that and you get as close as you can and you literally jab
Yep.
very, very quickly. And so the needles are very, intentionally chosen so that it's a thicker needle. It can get through the hide of the animal because wild animals have very thick hides,
Sure.
um, compared to us. So it gets through that hair and the hide, but it won't break. And it's, if it bends, it takes a lot of force to bend. Because once you jab it in there, the animal is probably going to flinch
For
or
sure.
move away. And you push on it to depress the syringe with that spring. And so the idea is that you are going to jab it in an area of the body that has a lot of padding so that there's very little risk of injury. You're not going to poke the bone, which, doesn't have necessarily a long-term effect, but it hurts.
Yeah.
You don't
Yep.
want to hurt them if you can't. And so basically the hip, between the front of the hip and the tail, there's some nice meaty muscle there. And so you jab them and then very quickly back away. And so you can just barely see it, wherever you are, and just sit down and you don't talk. Keep things very quiet. With anesthesia, and this is true for us too, the more stimulus that we have, whether it's auditory or physical touch, the faster we process through and metabolize those drugs. And so we want the animal to stay calm. We want them to, absorb this drug into their system, and then they'll eventually, they'll fight it. You'll see them bobbing their head. They don't want to give into it because behaviorally, they don't want to make themselves vulnerable. And so once they put their head down, and, we make some noises and they're not moving their head and their ears aren't, trying to listen,
Yeah.
then we know that that drug has taken effect and we get closer. And so the first thing you do is you put a muzzle on them. So one, it protects us from, it acts
That makes sense. Yep.
having a muscle or
Yep.
snapping, but it protects the animal. It protects their eyes from whatever, because sometimes they don't shut their eyes when they get anesthetized. And this is the same with deer. They
Sure.
also got a muzzle that had a face patch. So it went over their muzzle and then it covered up their head.
Okay.
So that's to protect them as well. And then very quickly go through, they get weighed, they get a blood sample taken. They do get their teeth inspected. So with wolves and carnivores like wolves, there are tooth charts that age an animal based on the wear of those teeth. So the wear of the carnassials and the molars, which are on the sides and the back, the more worn down they are, the older the animal is generally.
Yeah,
And
makes sense.
so trying to age the animal using those established methods of wear on the teeth, and then making note, do they have a broken canine? And then also checking in the mouth. So like I mentioned before, they might bite at the trap and they might bite at anything near them. And some of that anxiety might be destroying the shrub, that they're stuck on. And so there have been cases where a wolf will get like a stick or a twig caught between their teeth on the palate. So checking the palate in the mouth to make sure that there's no foreign debris that got stuck up in there. And then doing a full physical check, palpating all of the body to make sure that they haven't injured themselves. pulling the trap off, making sure that the trap where it was, that location, if there's any swelling, they carry ice packs for if it's a hot day, but also that can help with swelling, kind of rubbing the foot a little bit. And they carry hot packs. So, again, wildlife can be really sensitive when they're under anesthesia, and the environmental conditions make a big deal. So if it's a really hot day, they're going to put the ice packs, in the groin area and between their front arms to help cool the body and keep it cool. Um, or if it's a really cold day, hot packs in those area and a blanket to make sure that that animal, that their body temperature stays within the normal range. So again, taking the temperature and, um, you know, so somewhat similar to the deer, the same safety precautions, the same, checking, measuring, weighing, all of those same things, but the anesthesia part is a little bit different.
It's so cool. I mean, you're clearly, you had the education, you got the degree, like this is a very methodical process. But I'm curious, like, just for you, what was it like to connect with nature on this kind of a level for you?
Um, it was it was really cool
Yeah.
for one, because the more I did, the more I thought I can totally take my degree in animal science and apply it to wildlife. I just need to get extra experience in terms of academic studies. An agriculture degree, which is more of what I had, still covers a lot of similar things, ecology and anatomy and genetics. They're just on different animals and different situations. And so as I was doing this work, I was also learning and educating myself on, those specific species. So deer, or, I was very interested in moose and the other members of the weasel family that the pine marten is part of, otters and fisher and mink. Um, I had a ton of resources at this internship because we were staying at the field station where this project had been going on for decades. So there was so many accumulated resources where I kind of could do my own side thing, and then learning on the job as well. And so it really helped me figure out, like, yes, I can totally do this. So if I'm going to continue on that path to grad school, this is a wonderful experience that will show I'm capable and competent at doing this kind of a thing. But then on a more personal level, those are things that I experienced that the average person will never have an opportunity to do.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
and not only that, but being connected with the other wildlife studies going on in the area. There's a black bear study. They started during this time was when the state of Minnesota started investing resources in understanding the lynx of Minnesota. And up until this time, there wasn't data to support that there was a reproducing lynx population in Minnesota. And so they wanted to do studies. They wanted to radio collar. They wanted to get the actual hard data to support yes or no. Is there a reproducing population? So I got to help when they processed a lynx. I got to go help with that and get my hands on an actual lynx. And, those are things that connect you to nature in a completely different way, where you start understanding the processes that you read in a book or you watch on a documentary kind of all come together because
Absolutely.
it's actually happening.
Yeah, it's so cool. So I vividly remember my time in the Boundary Waters, and actually on that trip we also did 3 nights on Isle Royal. So I remember that too. And I remember just specifically thinking about wolves. And one night in the Boundary Waters, we were just sitting around our campfire, and we heard this pack of wolves. I mean, and like there had to be 20 or 30. I mean, there were so many uh, howling voices. It was absolutely incredible. But we were warned when we went in that it's very unlikely that you're going to see a wolf. You'll hear them, but you're not going to see them because they stay away. I'm just curious, like for you, being on the academic side of this and studying them, like what did you learn in this process about the wolf, and what do you want people to know about the wolf? It's, to me, it's such a, like, it's this very mysterious, cunning creature.
Yeah. So after this field tech job, I took an internship at the International Wolf Center and applied to grad school to study pine martens out in the East Coast, but then was offered a job at the Wolf Center and I took it. And so I never ended up going to grad school. But working at the Wolf Center, a lot of that education and some of what I talk about even now with like family or friends that aren't familiar or uncomfortable with true wilderness. And for me, true wilderness is where there are things that make you lower on the food chain.
Yeah.
So you are part of the food chain in some cases. Not realistically, there's nothing hunting you to eat you here.
Yep.
But it adds that element of it's my responsibility to be informed and aware of what I'm entering. So I'm entering the ecosystem of these animals and how my behavior might change interactions. So being responsible with my campsite, food storage, cleanup, all of those things. And with wolves and with all the wildlife really that we have here, they're going to avoid you as much as you want to avoid them. And they have adapted to living in this environment where there's a human presence. So they might avoid you, but they might not necessarily be petrified of you. They might be curious, and that's okay. It's not okay if you have, garbage everywhere and you left your bird feeder out, all spring, and you're attracting bears, or wolves or whatever animal that also scavenges, which is pretty much everything. If they can get a free meal, they will, because it's less energy they have to spend. But if you're out in the woods and you're hiking on a trail and you see a wolf cross the trail in front of you, that doesn't mean they're there because of you.
Yeah.
You just happen to see them crossing the trail when they cross the trail. And it's very rare that a wolf is going to approach you or follow you. Now, if you have a dog with you, that can completely change the scenario, because for wolves, dogs, especially dogs that are wolf size or not quite, like a lab, they're not as big as a wolf, but they look wolf-like by shape. The wolf might see that as an intruder in their territory, maybe not as another wolf, but definitely another canine that might be there to steal its resources or to kill their pups, So a dog's presence will definitely change the behavior of a wolf versus just a human walking in the woods. And that's a huge difference. And that's where if you see fresh wolf sign, maybe don't take your dog in that area, go somewhere else.
I think that's a
Keep
good
your
idea.
dog on a leash, don't let your dog roam. I would say when I was working at the Wolf Center, we offered a service called the helpline where people could call with concerns or questions. Most of the time that a dog was attacked by wolves was when the dog was off leash, allowed to roam way ahead or way behind or in the woods, or was allowed to roam outside. And it might have been by the house, but if they're not enclosed or secured in some way, that is kind of an open invitation for any wildlife to defend themselves in whatever way they think is appropriate. And so, it's kind of just common sense, safety.
Yeah, it is actually, and it's good. It's good awareness too. We definitely had our dog with us when we did our canoe trip into the Boundary Waters, but we kept him very close.
Mm-hmm.
So Jess, should we as humans be afraid of the big bad wolf?
Generally, no, I don't think so. I honestly, and I'm not, promoting a way to think one way or the other about mountain lions, but mountain lions scare me more than anything. Yeah, just just the way that their behavior
Yeah.
and the way that they hunt, their techniques. And same with grizzly bears. When I go out to grizzly country in Alaska, we were up in Denali National Park, and there's a lot of areas where, on the rivers, there's spaces where bears could hide. And just knowing that grizzly bears are very different than black bears. I'm used to black bears. Black bears run away from you. And if they try to come by you and you know, just do nothing, like the behavior is just so different. You fight back with a black bear and they kind of like, oh no, grizzly bears, I'm not as familiar with them. And same with
Yeah.
mountain lions. So for those animals, like I take way more precautions when I'm going into a wilderness setting when those animals are present, like every precaution that's recommended, bear spray, making a lot of noise, always kind of checking around my surroundings. Whereas here, we have black bears, we have wolves, we have coyotes. The only precautions that I actively think about is if I'm taking my dogs with me and making sure they stay close if they're
Yeah.
off leash, like if we're hunting for grouse, or we're walking on a trail. I always kind of watch for sign. If I see a really fresh wolf scat, I'm going to be much more diligent. I might even put my dog, make them heel, because I don't want them to get too far ahead of me. And if I'm by myself, it's just a matter of, do I have any food that smells really strong? Are we out in the boundary waters and we went fishing and we caught a lot of fish? We're going to cook them up. We're going to not leave them in the campsite overnight for long periods of time. And the fish guts, we're going to dispose of appropriately so that we're not attracting those animals to our campsite. So no, I don't think people need to be afraid of
Yeah.
wolves.
It's just a very different mindset when you're out in the wilderness versus being in the big city.
Yeah.
So Jess, you've lived a very diverse life from, studying to the Appalachian Trail to into being a field technician for these trapping based research projects, and then working at the Wolf Center. And now you're at the Dorothy Molter Museum. I'm just curious, like for you, if there's this common thread that sort of connects it all together for you.
Yes. There's kind of the obvious thread of outdoorsy wilderness settings that I'm
Mhm.
drawn to. Like being in an area where I'm not at the top of the food chain, to me, is like a challenge. And I like that challenge. Even though there's really no risk to me, if I'm smart about it. Um, but the evolution of, from horses to root beer kind of followed that wilderness path. The Appalachian Trail was, technically it's not true wilderness. You're pretty close to the East Coast where the most,
Yeah.
humans are
Okay.
in the United States.
Sure.
But you were off the beaten path. You
Yep.
were at least a day's hike from help, kind of a thing, to Ely, which we have amenities here. We have a grocery store, we have a hospital, we have things that you would need, but it's still remote. It's 20 minutes from the next nearest town. It's at literally the end of the road, and the Wolf Center focuses on
Yeah.
wildlands and wildlife. And Dorothy lived in the wilderness. So now I'm not necessarily teaching about specific species, but it's more of a holistic education
It's
about,
wilderness education,
yeah,
really, is what
yeah.
it is. Yeah. And so, Jess, I mean, this story with this common thread of wilderness education throughout your whole life, at some point Hollywood's going to pick up on your story and they're going to want to make a movie about you. And when they do, I want to know who the Hollywood actress is going to be that's going to play you in your movie.
So I was trying to think about what would be appropriate and somebody that could pass for me, but I think I'd go with Jennifer Lawrence.
Nice. Okay.
I mean, it's more her attitude. She can be sassy.
Yeah.
she can be goofy and self-deprecating in a positive way, but she can also be really serious. And so I think she has the qualities of an actress that I would like.
I love that. Yeah, totally. What's your movie going to be called?
Gosh, I don't know. This is gonna be long-winded a little bit. So on this Boundary Waters trip that I just came from, I just kind of happened in conversation where I was talking about all of these things that I've done in my life and experiences that I've been fortunate enough and privileged enough to enjoy. And they were like, "Man, your resume would be like 6 pages long." And so remembering that, I feel like some cheesy title like, A Life Well Lived,
Yeah. Okay.
or An Adventure Life Well Lived. I don't know, because it dawned on me that I have had some crazy experiences that the average person just would not have.
I love it. The Adventure Life Well Lived, starring Jennifer Lawrence. It's going to
There
be a
you
great
go.
movie.
There
I
you
can't
go.
wait. Well, the other thing that you said a couple of times that really resonated with me was, "I'm not the top of the food chain." And when you're in the wild, those are words to live by out there for sure. That's a
Yeah.
great one.
Yeah.
Jess, thank you so much for the time that you gave me today. I really appreciate it. It was really fun to learn about wolves and the process that you go through. Just really appreciate it and admire the work that you do. And for those listening, I hope you've been inspired today as much as I have. I hope that Jess's story has encouraged you to listen to the voice inside that calls you to adventure, because we want to hear your story next. If you have a story to tell or just need a nudge to create one, please send me an email. We'd also appreciate it if you'd help us spread the word by leaving a review and sharing or tagging Inspire Campfire in your social media. And until next time, I want to encourage you to get outside. Thanks for listening. Jess, thanks so much for being back here today.
Thanks for having me.